Though he wasn't born here, and some in the town today are not pleased by it, Monroe, Michigan is more closely associated with George Armstrong Custer than any other town. In this video, we'll take a look at Custer's life and search for traces of it in Monroe. Originally called Frenchtown after French-Canadian settlers, the town was renamed Monroe after President James Monroe following the War of 1812, in which fighting occurred here more than once. Custer's half-sister Lydia and her husband David Reed hosted young Custer as a boy when he came to Monroe to attend school. Though he was often away, Custer would more and more come to regard Monroe as his hometown. We'll start our tour of Custer sites at the Monroe County Historical Museum. The museum is located where the childhood home of Custer's wife Libby once stood. That home was relocated to another part of the city. In a way, the Custers have come home, as they have their own floor in the museum. Custer's father, Emmanuel, was a blacksmith, a farmer, and a staunch Democrat. His ancestors, the Custers, had immigrated to America in the late 1600s from the Rhineland in modern-day Germany. His mother, Maria, or Marie, was of Scotch-Irish descent and had 3 children from a previous marriage. Both of Custer's parents were widowers at the time of their marriage. George was their firstborn, and they went on to have 3 more sons, Tom, Boston, and Nevin, and a daughter, Margaret, the youngest. From boyhood onward, George acquired the nickname of Audie, which would be used by those close to him. Nothing remains of the new Rumley, Ohio house where Custer was born on December 5, 1839, except a few artifacts and the foundation. A few stones from that foundation are on display at the museum. Today, a statue of Custer stands at the site, and a nearby building contains a small museum of related artifacts. A few items related to Custer's childhood are at the Monroe Museum, including baby clothes. Even as a baby, it's hard for me to think of Custer in a dress. Custer's future wife Elizabeth, or Libby as she was known, was the daughter of wealthy and influential Judge Daniel Bacon and his wife Eleanor. Libby lost her 3 siblings and her mother before reaching the age of 13. Her father became especially protective of her, and he must have had his hands full, as she grew up to be attractive, intelligent, and especially flirtatious. Though they were aware of each other, Custer and Libby would not formally meet until the Civil War raged. This was the Bacon family home, moved to its current location in the early 1900s. George and Libby stayed here for a time in 1869, as Libby later would after her husband's death. This is the uniform of a West Point cadet. Custer would have worn something very similar in his day. The real story of Custer at West Point would in itself make quite a movie. After Custer's graduation from McNeely Normal School in Hopedale, Ohio, he became a school teacher in nearby Cadiz. It soon became clear to him that he wanted more out of life than grading student papers, and he began to think of going to West Point Military Academy. Meanwhile, he began a romance with the daughter of his boarding house landlord, who absolutely disapproved of the relationship. Since the man was a prominent local political official, he was able to get Custer his appointment to West Point, and thus separated Custer from his daughter. Custer entered the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York in July 1857 for what would normally have been a 5-year program of study. At West Point, the rebellious side of Custer emerged. Custer's record was one of the worst, if not the worst, in the history of the Academy, both in terms of demerits and academic achievement. Either in spite of this, or maybe because of it, Custer was actually one of the more popular cadets among his classmates. Sometime around the year 1859, Custer appears to have contracted gonorrhea, probably after a visit to New York City, and it's possible that he was rendered sterile as a result. It's quite ironic that Custer, a most rebellious cadet, would go on to fight against the Confederate Rebellion in the upcoming war, while Robert E. Lee, who never was given a single demerit at West Point, would go on to lead a rebel army. With the outbreak of war in the spring of 1861, there was an immediate need for officers in the U.S. Army, so the program at West Point was reduced to 4 years, and Custer was miraculously allowed to graduate, even if he was at the bottom of his class. As if his troubled record wasn't bad enough, while Custer was awaiting assignment after graduation, he got into further trouble. While he was officer of the day, he failed to stop a fight that broke out amongst incoming cadets. He was found guilty in his first court-martial, but luck and the need for officers were on his side, and he only received a reprimand. Custer's first assignment as a second lieutenant was to help drill new recruits in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry Regiment, stationed in Washington City, now called Washington, D.C. Beginning with the Battle of First Bull Run in July 1861, Custer would take part in every important battle experienced by the Union Army of the Potomac. Custer became an aide to Commanding General George McClellan during the Virginia Peninsula Campaign in 1862. At one point, he took a patrol out and came back with some prisoners and a Confederate battle flag, captured for the first time by the Army of the Potomac. Custer took part in the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, and was also present when Lincoln came to visit McClellan the following month. That fall, Custer, while on leave, was formally introduced to Libby Bacon in Monroe. Reportedly, Custer was far more impressed with Libby than she with him, but Custer had a way of growing on people when he wanted to, especially once he started to become publicly known for his exploits in the war. In June 1863, just prior to the Battle of Gettysburg, Union Cavalry Commander Alfred Pleasanton advanced Custer several ranks, all the way up to Brigadier General of the Volunteer Army, and gave him command of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade. Custer was just 23. At this point, Custer started wearing more showy uniforms, partly because he was a born show-off, but also because he wanted his men to be able to find him in the smoke and confusion of the battlefield, as he intended to lead from the front. Also, he had let his hair grow long and often in ringlets, on which he frequently used cinnamon-scented hair oil. He stood about 5'11" and wore a size 38 jacket, and was surprisingly fastidious. Custer had the curiously good fortune of avoiding serious injury while many of the men around him fell. It began to be referred to as Custer's luck. Just before the Battle of Gettysburg began, the Union Cavalry, along with Custer's brigade, fought a skirmish with Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalry at Hanover, Pennsylvania, the result of which was to further delay Stuart from reuniting with Robert E. Lee's army, from which he had already been separated from for several days. On July 2nd, the second day of the battle, Custer was almost captured in another skirmish, but was rescued in the nick of time by one of his men. Custer's luck was still holding. Finally, on July 3rd, the last day of the battle, Custer personally led his men on a cavalry charge that helped stop Jeb Stuart's attack on the rear of the Union lines. Had Stuart's attack been successful, it's possible that Gettysburg would have been a Union Army defeat instead of a victory. Another victory for Custer was that Libby's father finally consented to allow Libby and Custer to marry. And, before the year was out, Custer's parents moved to Monroe, purchasing this house for $1,000. On February 9, 1864, here at the First Presbyterian Church in Monroe, Custer and Libby became man and wife. The church has since been remodeled, but this was the place. Over the months and years, Custer and Libby wrote many extraordinary letters to each other. Their mutual passion was always just under the surface and appeared to be quite intense. This is Martin's shoe store in Monroe. In this same store, Custer had his boots made. One of the very few shoe stores in the country to remain in one location, decade after decade. Three months after the wedding, the Army of the Potomac began its overland campaign in Virginia. General Phil Sheridan was now in charge of the Cavalry Corps, and after the Battle of the Wilderness in May 1864, Custer was given command of an entire cavalry division. It was one of his men who mortally wounded Jeb Stuart at the Battle of Yellow Tavern on May 11th. The following month, at the Battle of Trevilian Station, Custer was able to capture a Confederate train of supply wagons, but then was surrounded and cut off. Phil Sheridan sent reinforcements that rescued Custer's men and gave them a way out, saving them from capture or death. Historian Eric Wittenberg has termed this entire action as Custer's first last stand. This time Custer's luck held. In April 1865, Custer was given the temporary rank of Major General, and it was his division that effectively blocked Lee's army from escape at the very end. After Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, which, by the way, was not the actual end of the Civil War, General Sheridan was able to buy the pine table that Grant had used at the surrender and present it to Custer as a gift to Libby. Eventually, Custer's brother Tom brought the table back to Monroe, where Libby's father placed it on display. At the museum is a replica of that table. The original is at the Smithsonian Institution. A few weeks after the surrender, Custer had his men illegally seize a prize racehorse near Clarksville, Virginia. It was this horse that Custer rode in the Grand Review Parade in Washington on May 23rd. Custer stole the show when the horse suddenly bolted. Custer claimed later that the horse had gotten spooked, but many historians think this was another case of Custer showing off. After an unpleasant assignment in the Gulf Coast occupation forces, in which Custer's men came close to mutiny, Custer mustered out of the Volunteer Army in February 1866 and took an extended leave to consider his options. In July 1866, Custer was made Lieutenant Colonel of the newly formed 7th Cavalry Regiment, stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas. Just over 2 years later, Custer was arrested for leaving his post without permission to see Libby. The end result was that at his second court-martial, he was found guilty and was suspended for a year without pay. Once again, Phil Sheridan came to the rescue, and through his intervention, Custer was allowed to rejoin his regiment after just a few months. Custer would be needed as part of Sheridan's upcoming campaign against the Cheyenne out west. As the U.S. began to push westward, hostilities with the local Native American peoples inevitably increased, and massacres and atrocities were committed by both sides. Custer actually had no particular hostility toward the Indians as a race, and in fact enjoyed the company of his Native American scouts. He once wrote that if he were an Indian, he would rather be among the free peoples of the open plains rather than submit to life on the reservation. In the last year of his life, he wrote that no one who really understands the Indian question and is a member of a civilized nation would be in favor of extermination of the Indians. However, when a tribe was officially considered hostile, he had no trouble with the idea of attacking them and putting them onto a reservation if possible. Unfortunately, hostilities were ever increasing, and the U.S. government made things worse by breaking numerous treaties with various tribes. In November 1868, Custer attacked an encampment of southern Cheyenne under Chief Black Kettle at the Battle of Washita River. In addition to warriors, some women and children were killed in the fighting, and many of the Cheyenne were forced onto a reservation. Many historians say this was a massacre, not a battle. Black Kettle himself was shot down in the fighting. A number of sources say that Custer eventually took the daughter of the slain chief as his mistress, and Cheyenne folklore says he even fathered children with her, though many historians believe Custer was sterile by this time. In August 1871, Custer and his brother Nevin bought this house and farm together, and after Custer's death, one of his horses named Dandy was brought back here to live and is buried somewhere near the barn. Two years later, Custer and the 7th Cavalry were sent to the Dakota Territory, and the following year, gold was discovered on one of its expeditions, which triggered the Great Black Hills Gold Rush. In 1875, the Grant administration tried unsuccessfully to buy the land from the Sioux, and after that failed, the government issued orders to the tribes in the area to report to reservations or be considered hostile. The U.S. Army was issued orders to round up the tribes that refused to do so. A three-pronged attack was planned for the spring of 1876, with Custer and General Alfred Terry to lead one of the wings. However, before the campaign could begin, Custer was summoned to Washington to testify regarding alleged corruption involving Grant's Secretary of War, William Belknap. Specifically, the charge of accepting money to give licenses to traders to have the sole right to sell goods on frontier trading posts. This practice reportedly led to exorbitant prices being charged at the outposts. Custer's testimony seemed to confirm the charges, and in other statements, he seemed to be implicating one of President Grant's own brothers in the charge. Grant's response was to remove Custer from the upcoming campaign against the Sioux, and he even had Custer arrested when he left Washington without approval. Public pressure caused Grant to relent, however, and Custer was allowed to return to command. But Grant wanted Custer's commanding officer, General Alfred Terry, to directly supervise Custer in the upcoming campaign. However, Custer made a direct plea to Terry, and unbeknownst to Washington, he was allowed to operate independently. While Custer was to march west from Fort Abraham Lincoln in North Dakota, Colonel John Gibbon was to take his troops east from Fort Ellis in Montana, and finally General George Crook was to march north from Fort Fetterman in Wyoming. All three of these groups were to converge and mount a large-scale attack on the non-compliant tribes. Unbeknownst to the army, Lakota Holy Man Sitting Bull had called together a gathering of the Sioux, the Lakota, the Arapaho, and the Northern Cheyenne. This gathering was so large that it could not settle in one place for long, as available food supplies would rapidly dwindle. Estimates of the warriors alone were between 1,000 and 5,000. Eventually, they moved to the valley of the Little Bighorn River in Montana. This was Crow country, and they had not received permission from the Crow Nation before coming here. The Crow in turn provided scouts to the army in the upcoming campaign and gave them permission to expel the trespassing tribes. The conventional belief among the U.S. Army at that time was that the Indians would scatter in any large-scale assault by the Army. Custer was so confident in victory that he refused an offer of extra men and weapons from General Terry, saying they would just slow him down. Indeed, Custer was so anxious to travel quickly that he ran too far ahead of the other wings of the offensive. And, unbeknownst to Custer, General Crook had already fought an engagement and had retreated for a time as a result. When Custer arrived at the Little Bighorn, he would be alone. No one in the cavalry realized how many warriors he would face. All in all, 5 additional men from Monroe were with Custer that day. 2 brothers, 1 brother-in-law, a nephew, and longtime friend George Yates. All 6 would share the same fate. Custer's brother, Captain Tom Custer, a Medal of Honor winner from the Civil War, would command one of the 7th Cavalry's 12 companies, in his case, Company C. Captain George Yates commanded Company F. Brother-in-law First Lieutenant James Calhoun commanded Company L. Brother Boston Custer and nephew Harry Reed, also nicknamed Audie, were civilians employed to work with the mules carrying supplies, called the pack train. When they learned of the impending action, they rode forward to be with Custer, sealing their fate. Another civilian traveling with them was part-time newspaper reporter, Canadian-born Mark Kellogg. Even though General Sherman had given orders that Custer was not to take any reporters with him, Custer's love of publicity led him to do otherwise, and Kellogg would share the same fate as the others. On Sunday, June 25, 1876, Custer was nearing the Indian encampment when he divided his regiment into battalions. One would be led by his second-in-command, Major Marcus Reno. Reno's group was to cross the Little Bighorn River and attack the southern end of the village. Reno's attack was repulsed, and he retreated back across the river to high ground, where his men would spend the day fighting for their lives. The 2nd Battalion, led by Captain Frederick Benteen, was initially sent south on a scouting mission. Benteen eventually received this message from Custer, telling him to come quick. Here you see Custer's original writing at the bottom of the note, with a transcription of Custer's scribbling up at the top, written by Custer's aide, First Lieutenant William Cook, from Ontario, Canada. Benteen headed north again towards Custer, but saw Major Reno's command in trouble and joined him, and this probably saved both battalions from annihilation. But now Custer was truly alone. Custer had taken his approximately 210 men a few miles to the north. His horse was called Vic, short for victory. Contrary to popular belief, his hair had been cut short before he had started out several days earlier, and it was too hot for him to wear a buckskin jacket, though he was probably wearing buckskin trousers. Also, contrary to popular belief, Sitting Bull did not take part in the battle. He was a holy man like an elder statesman. Others did the fighting. And so it was that Custer and all his battalion with him were killed that day. Custer's luck finally ran out. The details of Custer's last stand are uncertain and still being debated. It does appear certain, however, that Custer was shot twice in the left side. The first one near his heart was probably the one that killed him, and the second one in the left temple was probably done after his death, since that wound bled very little. The bodies of Custer and his men were found 2 days later, when General Terry arrived with Colonel Gibbon's troops. Custer and his brother Tom were buried side by side in a shallow grave. Their bodies and grave were given the best protection from scavengers that the soldiers could do under the circumstances. The Custer family were members of this Methodist church in Monroe. It was here that on August 13, 1876, a special service was held for the 6 men that Monroe lost at the Little Bighorn. Custer's parents had lost 3 sons, a son-in-law, and a grandson that day in June. This photo was taken at the scene of the last stand during the spring of 1877, showing horse and possibly human skeletons and various battlefield debris. The camera is aimed in the direction of where the Indian encampment was, far off in the distance. Later that same year, an exhumation party returned to the battlefield and was unable to positively identify Custer's grave. They finally dug up a grave and found a skull, rib cage, and leg bone, and decided these were the remains of George Armstrong Custer. Historians are divided as to whether they got it right, but among the remains was a tuft of hair that Libby believed was her husband's. The remains they brought back were sent to West Point for reburial on October 10, 1877. After Custer's death, Libby was devastated both emotionally and financially. She began to write articles and books and give public lectures about her husband, and in doing so, help Custer's legend grow even stronger. Libby never remarried and kept her husband's memory alive up to her own death in 1933. Libby's remains rest at the Custer gravesite at West Point Military Academy in New York. Custer's brother Tom, brother-in-law Jimmy Calhoun, and George Yates were all reburied at Fort Leavenworth Cemetery in Kansas. And at the Woodland Cemetery in Monroe, we can find the final resting places of many prominent local citizens, including members of the Custer and Bacon families. This is the Custer family plot. Among the graves here are those of Custer's parents. Marie Custer died 6 years after she lost her sons at the Little Bighorn, and Emmanuel would follow her 10 years later. Custer's half-sister Lydia Reed is also buried here. She gave Custer a place to stay as a boy when he first came to Monroe. Her only son Audie died with Custer that day. the grave of Custer's brother Boston. Both Boston and Audie Reed's remains were exhumed from the battlefield and returned to the family in Monroe, contrary to the Army's policy of exhuming only commissioned officers. This is the Bacon family plot. Here Libby's parents Daniel and Eleanor are buried, along with 2 sisters and a brother. All but her father died before Libby reached the age of 13. Finally, we come to Custer's statue in Monroe, now at its 3rd location. Created by sculptor Edward Potter, it was unveiled by President Taft in 1910, with Libby in attendance. The statue was meant to depict Custer preparing to ride out to meet Jeb Stuart's men at the Battle of Gettysburg. In the 1920s, the statue was thought to be a traffic hazard, and so was moved to the Soldiers and Sailors Park along the River Raisin. In 1955, the statue was moved again down the street to its present location. Some in Monroe today want the statue moved yet again, away from the public eye. To them, Custer is a symbol of the greed, intolerance, and aggression shown toward the Native Americans. Custer might point out at his service in ending a war and slavery, and that the federal government waged war on the tribes, not specifically him. Still, you can't help but wonder if Custer's spirit, deep down, is enjoying the controversy, and especially the publicity.